The city's death was slow and cruel. An orbital bombardment, fire from the pitiless skies, would have been a terrible end, but at least a swift one. A bloody sack would have been slower, but once the frenzied tide had passed over, there would at least have been a kind of peace in the dripping silence, a final end to horror and to grief. Yet the solemn citadels and flowing boulevards of Ardenos faced a doom that lacked even the frail dignity of those fates. A doom reserved for those who for some unguessable purpose are made the sport of the monstrous forces that govern the motions of the stars. There would be no climactic moment of metropolitan murder. Ardenos would face a lingering death that was not a death. Not a single knife thrust to the heart, but the multiplying agonies of an infected wound. For the Lord of Plagues was victor over Ardenos, and his celebratory habits were cheerfully bare of mercy. Abalene looked through the leaded window panes of the graceful house she'd once been so proud of, and wept with a hopeless dread so vast that it bordered on a strange kind of ecstasy. The vault of heaven above her was dyed in vomitous hues and quartered by twining rivers of flies in their triumphal millions. The quaint rooftops below seethed with corpse beetles, maggots and unidentifiable pus-wet things that boiled through gutters and slopped down walls in a loathsome tide. Thumping over the city skyline came great war creatures, their machine limbs hideously crooked and arthritic, garlanded in rank fumes that crawled outwards, eating up every breath of clean air left in the world. Even here, in the last unspoilt quarter of ill-starred Ardenos, a mile away and behind thick glass, her panic-flaring nostrils could pick up the stench. The worst of all was beneath that spreading fume, she knew. They'd broadcast themselves onto every public picked screen in Ardenos to make sure that everyone knew what they looked like. She had looked up at one from a market square in morbid interest and caught a single mind-scourging glimpse before she blanched away and fled for home, retching and weeping. The picked screen had been crowded with the screeching beast-faced mutants and half-rotted shock soldiery of the Chaos Host, and behind them their terrible masters. The stamping ranks of monsters whose armor crawled with slick unlife and whose eyes were glowing witchlights. And behind them, more obscene presences still, mercifully half-blurred by static, loping out of the dark and slavering for their demon god's victory feast. Abalene flinched from the blooming darkness beyond the window, unable to endure any more. She reeled like a drunkard back through the quiet shadows of her home, slamming doors behind her till the distant roars and screams were blotted out for a few more precious moments. She clambered up the main staircase, skidding on discarded food, tripping on her shattered possessions and blinking dizzily in the overhead lumen light that fizzed and flickered, never to shine clear again. She just wanted to look at him. One long, longing look, reassuring herself that he was still alive. The bedroom door creaked back before an unsteady hand. She stood on the threshold, and her hot tears ran immediately. A bitter rain that she now doubted would ever stop. Her boy's face was like a wax death mask now, but she knew he was still alive from the way his blanket trembled, as the ravaged body below jerked and shook with endless microspasms. He couldn't truly sleep anymore, but exhaustion had sent him into a kind of fugue state, a dull twilight between sleep and waking. The occasional low moan or raw-edged wheeze escaped his bleeding lips, but his eyes were unfocused and uncomprehending, looking only at pain. As far as Abalene knew, he had lived longer than any other case of the new pox to date, despite the lack of steady hands to tend to him. Half the household staff had fled, a further quarter had been conscripted and were doubtless now dying in creative ways at the barricade streets away. With a handful of mysteriously immune exceptions, the rest of Abalene's domestics had all died of the warp-bred disease a week earlier, frothy blood and bile dribbling free of burst lips as their eyes finally glazed and their limbs drummed a final mad dance on their sodden beds. But her boy lived, sustained perhaps by the rare strength of his lineage. It was the knowledge that the blood of heroes ran in him that sustained Abalene's final Firefly mote of hope. His forebears had been champions and warlords, with a great-great-great-uncle on his father's side who, according to family lore, had been inducted into the Angels of Death, and even now walked impossible battlefields a galaxy away, to the everlasting pride of his descendants. Even now, there was a patrician sternness to the set of the dying boy's features, an echo of nobility, like a weathered statue that still spoke to the mastery of its maker through the moss and mold of its ruin. She saw the taunting visions in her mind's eye, her son, her Daniel, becoming the first to throw off the pox and recover, a measure of life and strength rising in him like the dawn. The two of them hand in hand, winging through the streets of Ardenos with the nightmare falling away behind them, reaching the ruins of the spaceport, finding an intact shuttle forgotten in the anarchy, somehow willing it into orbit. But there was no shuttle. No streets not clogged with corpses or screaming mobs or dull-eyed cult murderers. No cure. Abalene thought of that legendary great-great-great-uncle, wondering where he was now. In a granite mausoleum for the victorious slain, burning a rebellious hive in another segmentum, or perhaps even now he was in close orbit, minutes away from a fiery avenging descent to save his birthplace from the enemy. Dashing the tears from her eyes, Abalene slunk to the nearest window and peered hopefully upwards. The sky was the same, but worse. The cloud cover thickening and curdling into vast toxic reefs laced with hordes of black demonic flies like pulsing veins. You could hear the buzzing now. You could probably hear the buzzing in orbit. No shining comet of fire came. With nothing else left, Abalene sank to her knees and prayed as she'd never prayed in her life before. In a cobblestone square a few minutes' walk from Abalene's house, cultists in stiff rags and rusted body armor shambled forwards in loose formation, gripping looted PDF rifles in boil-pocked hands. The turncoat sergeant leading them mumbled a placatory prayer of his own to the grandfather as slithering parasites squelched beneath his boot heels. One of the locals, lamed by shrapnel and wriggling on the cobbles, whimpered a strangled plea for mercy as the sergeant approached him. The cult soldier swung his las rifle on his strap and sank to one knee, swatting aside the civilian's flailing hands. He made a few passes with his knife, opening deep cuts which he laughingly smeared with the juices of crushed parasite creatures, ensuring that multiple fiendish infections would ignite in the deep places of the man's body. Ignoring the newly blessed victim's shrill wailing, he rose with another prayer, sheathing his knife and signaling to the squad to move on. Abalene's fine-looking house swam into view, sitting proudly on raised ground above the crowding rooftops of the common homes around it, like a mounted officer marshalling the milling infantry for a final stand. The sergeant instantly recognized the worth in securing it as a strongpoint and hissed instructions to the squad. Advance, secure, desecrate. Abruptly, the sergeant smelled something, a cold, harsh tang that somehow cut through the melange of competing foulness that now blanketed the city. There was a sudden charge in the air, a humming tension like the moment before the breaking of a storm. A dull thunderclap, a burst of frigid light, a perfect circle of the street's surface was seared clean, crawling plague creatures reduced to fine black dust, a corpse rendered into a fading ghost of ash. 6 forms stood in formation, more than human in bulk, armored in pitchy black and bleached white. For a moment, this corner of Ardenos was suddenly horribly silent. Even the background roar of the city's fall muffled into a muted drone. The cultists gawped, hopelessly confused as to the nature of these newcomers. Their unspoken questions were answered by a bellow of synchronized bolter fire. Silently, the grim Astartes tramped through the shredded remains of the cultist squad, mirroring the line of advance of their own victims. The sergeant looked down at his own spilling stomach, taking perverse comfort in the leaking ruin, knowing he would see the Plague Father face to face soon. With dimming eyes, he looked up at one of the Astartes as it passed, noting with stoic amusement the curious icon embossed on the brute's shoulder. A spiked black and white skull, the void spilling out of its glaring sockets. Abalene was shaken from her prayers by the crackle of autogun fire. The staccato sounds were close and getting closer. close enough to be sharply distinct from the general sonic horror of Ardenos' doom. A cold wash of primitive fear shook her back to herself, momentarily stilling her own tremoring. And with stalking primitive movements, she crawled to the nearest window and squinted out. She could see running figures scattering out of the street mouths below, fleeing citizenry who jerked and fell by the dozen, then the score. The barricades had clearly shattered, and the battlefront was closing. Soon, the grinning abominations she glimpsed on the pic screen would be here, surely eager to make sport of her, to make sport of her boy. Abalene's face went hard and still with a savage resolve. Eyes wide and gleaming with near madness, she strode towards her husband's private chambers. The Imperial Guard Brigadier, long departed for an interstellar war from which she now knew he would never return. Though she needed his presence desperately, all she had now were the few tokens he'd left behind: neatly pressed clothes, a few worn medals and a polished box. The tang of his cigar smoke that never quite left the air and made her want to start weeping again. And the display case near the master bed, the silver glass shimmering faintly. Abalene keyed in the passcode and the security measures shut down with a contented murmur. The case hinged open, and Abalene plucked out the sleek las rifle, running her hands over the embossed gilt on the stock, the stylized Aquila marked with the household crest between its two rearing heads. She handled it deftly, snapping the power pack in and checking the sights, remembering a pleasant tutorial at a firing range and a day of game hunting a lifetime ago. She would kill them until they were forced to kill her. In fact, she would kill them until they were forced to blow the house off its foundations. If her boy was to die, his death would be the clean end to a filthy ordeal. He would die with his mother protecting him. A mother's duty, discharged to the very end.
Are we close? The time window here is a slender and uncomfortable one.
The first voice was hard and edged, like a sword stroke cleaving air.
Very close. We are within agreed mission time parameters, but we must advance quickly.
This voice was cultured, but the culture it suggested was one so cruel that it circled all the way back around to barbarism. The voice was knowledgeable, but it was knowledge not of art and medicine and philosophy, but torture and poison gas and fanaticism.
I could stand to linger for a while.
The third voice was rough and had something of tavern brawls and prize fights to it.
Culling these plague leeches is a fine use of my time, however limited. We cannot fight a world.
The first voice again.
And to rise to the notice of enemy command at this juncture would be unwise. More important than our world-fighting abilities, if we linger for the sake of a gunfight, then we lose the prize,
said the second voice.
I sense his vitality fading. I can keep soul tethered to body, but I need proximity. Hurry.
Veteran Sergeant Kalfus nodded and rapped out more sword-stroke words.
Brothers, advance. Double time. Combat Protocol Quintus. Arius ward the rear, if you are so eager to trade ammunition with Plague Spawn.
The sons of Malice proceeded swiftly towards their goal, hell itself a waxing roar behind them. Abalene eased open an upper window and settled into a firing position. Visibility was dropped rapidly as the soaring fly legions arced overhead. Combined with the smoke of distant fires and the fog of poisoned air the enemy projected before itself, it was enough to blank out the heavens and drown Ardenos in endless false night. Give me a target. Abalene prayed privately in the ravaged halls of her mind. Give me one good chance to strike. But she was losing the light, and the howl of ruin was growing louder until she knew nothing but awful grinding noise. Cursing softly, she pawed at the control switch for the security lights with a shaking hand, and stark radiance blazed out over the mansion grounds, revealing the scrawny figures that were boiling like maggots over the wall and tramping across the lawns. With a scream of terror and hate, Abalene fired. Unsteady as she was, the lasbolt went wide, scoring over the heads of the damned soldierly. A fusillade of autogun fire and las rounds answered her, and she cringed down to the carpeted floor, feeling shards of glass land in her hair and clothes as the half-open window disintegrated. The pock of weapons fire striking the outer wall was a malevolent staccato. Bent low, she scurried to another window, thumbed the las rifle to full auto, and rose, swinging the weapon to her shoulder and firing a full burst through the pain at the swarming figures below with a wordless screech. At least this time they scattered and ducked, and there were croaking shouts of alarm. And a hard round that clipped her shoulder blade and sent her sprawling like a forgotten toy, shaking with pain and shock. Abalene clawed at the wound and sobbed. She heard the crack of doors giving way below her, and a shriek of alarm from one of the household maids that turned into a bubbling scream that didn't seem to end, only climb higher and higher until it left the range of human hearing. Abalene rolled onto her stomach and began to crawl towards her son's room, gripped by the sudden realization of the insanity of her plan for a last stand. Now the only priority was the grim mathematics of mercy. A last round for him, then another for her. And then, if every sermon she'd ever heard had been true, they would embrace again at the foot of the golden throne. She somehow gathered her legs beneath her and rose from a crawl to a stumbling simian lope. She rounded a corner, smearing her own blood on the torn wallpaper, and fixed wide, half-mad eyes on her Daniel's bedroom door. She was just in time to see a tall cultist wrapped in oozing black leather, its ill-shaped skull a gangrenous nightmare, step through it with bayonet raised. Abalene screamed again, a hoarse, animal sound. The figure turned and grinned at her. Its eyes were sparking emeralds and its face ran like wax, shimmering. It gave a slow nod and saluted her with the rust-spotted, filth-smeared bayonet blade before it stepped out of sight into the bedroom and swung the door shut behind it. Brother Sepius's bolter gave a harsh double crack, and a pair of infected soldiers came apart, splattering gore and pus across the cobbles. Sergeant Kalfus's sensory display fizzed with the glittering scars of weapon blasts. Inwardly reciting a prayer of hatred to the supreme paradox, he smartly aimed and fired his bolter at the luminous outline of each target of opportunity. Life signs shivered and winked out in sequence. Unwilling to break taboo and speak aloud during combat, he triggered a quick rhythmic sequence of static pulses over the inter-squad vox, signaling to his comrades to shift to attack pattern Sextus. The squad smoothly adopted the new formation, though Kalfus ground his teeth in irritation at the audible sound of Arius's rough, too eager breathing over the channel. He's starting to enjoy himself too much, thought Kalfus, and it's unbecoming. He will need to be watched closely, lest heretical influences creep in. Half the squad warded their flanks and rear as the other half stormed the wall surrounding the genteel property, snapshots dropping the cultists still clinging to it like filthy spiders. A shuddering body fell across Kalfus's shoulders and tumbled off him onto the cobbles with a crackle of breaking bones and a damp chuckle that ended when his boots stove in the creature's temple. They didn't bother to scale the wall or search for a gate. They just balled through it, masonry clattering off their armor. The lawn was thronged with the enemy, a heaving mob that was soon venting lashings of blood as bolter fire chopped into it. More diseased troopers were already piling through smashed doorways and empty window frames. A curse clawed at the back of Kalfus's throat, stifled with effort. It seemed suspiciously like they were already too late. The cultist stood over the boy's bed and smiled his repulsive parody of a smile again. The youth twitched and moaned, his hands swatting feebly at sodden sheets, clearly in the vice of some nightmare. The cult soldier of Nurgle desperately wanted the lad to open his eyes so he could see the nightmare was real. Tragically, the boy showed no sign of waking, and the observer's appraising gaze told him it was unlikely the boy ever would. He was sinking deeper into green and rotting dreams. Soon his innards would be a rich soup of torment, and the final and most wonderful changes could begin. Of course, such changes could always be enhanced, heightened. The cultist grinned wide enough that his cheeks split with a drizzle of foulness. He lowered the wet and teeming edge of his bayonet towards the boy's sore-marked face. The bedroom door flew off its hinges with a gunshot crack of splitting wood. The cultist wheeled, perfectly presenting himself for a close-range las round that flash-fried his rancid guts. He swayed, eyes bulging, and hefted his rifle. Abalene was sprawled on the fallen door from where she'd hurled herself against it. Snarling, she rose to a kneeling position, corrected her grip on her husband's rifle, and fired again. The round bored through the enemy's torso and crisped the wallpaper behind him. The cultist wheezed once and toppled. Barely aware of the blood that was now soaking through her clothing and spotting the carpet, Abalene clawed her way to her son's bedside. She clung to him and sobbed noiselessly, aware of the crashing footfalls and raving voices that rapidly drew closer. For a fleeting moment his eyelids tremored, as if he was about to wake, as if he could hear her. There was a flicker of tension in his limbs, of rare and awesome strength. But a pain spasm crumpled his face, the strength winked out, and he slumped back onto the mattress, reclaimed by the nightmare. Abalene gripped the las rifle and steeled herself. It was only when she grimly blinked the tears out of her eyes in preparation for the task that she focused enough to see that the weapon's power pack was depleted. The screaming, inhuman voices were right outside the door. Unfathomable sounds blasted her. The voices reached a lunatic crescendo and fell away. And suddenly, shockingly, throughout the mansion, there was only a terrible silence. The door frame buckled and tore wider as a giant entered. The whirring armor was an eye-savaging mix of sterile bone white and a black that made the creature's bulky form seem like a door into deep space. Its greaves were daubed with blood and ooze, and hot smoke fumed from the muzzle of its bolter. It glowered down at Abalene, unspeaking. Her mind hanging by the last threads of sanity, Abalene could only gawp. Calphus registered his brothers signaling silently from the abattoir that the mansion and its grounds had now become. No contacts. Any surviving enemy had scrambled back beyond the perimeter and were doubtless now summoning help. Time was short.
Witch,
Rapped Calphus.
I have eyes on the prize. Get in here, quickly.
The sorcerer Paimon stepped in, smoky shadows coiling around the staff he clutched in one sigil-etched gauntlet. With an oddly gentle motion, he slid Abalene aside and craned over the dying boy. Warp fire sparked in the eye slits of his sculpted visor as he studied the awesome damage done to the youth's vitals.
So close,
Paimon hissed, voice tense with frustration.
I can see the strength in him. See it even as it wanes, but it is unfueled. I can spark a flame to burn the pestilence out of him, but I lack kindling. He will be dead and rotting in moments.
Please, croaked Abalene, dazed and now wading from the shallows of hysteria to the deeps of true madness. Please help him. He's a good boy. He's tough like his father, like all his fathers. His ancestor was Astartes.
This chapter does not need well-behaved boys,
Grunted Paimon.
It needs those who will do whatever it takes to fight and win. I can see the potentiality caged inside him, but the fiery spirit, it is not there.
I will do whatever it takes, gasped Abalene. Me. Take every drop of blood out of me and put it into him. Paimon turned to her thoughtfully. The malformed shadows that clung to him thickened, crooking into claws and pinions.
A mother's love,
the sorcerer said.
Yes, I understand. What could you possibly understand?
Calphus growled.
None of us remember our mothers. How could this female possibly serve us? The rite of consummation,
said Paimon, sliding a silvered combat knife from its sheath. Calphus had seen enough that it was nigh impossible to shock him, but there was still a faint note of surprise in his voice.
The boy is totally unaugmented. How could the rite possibly take? It requires strength, The very thing he lacks. I deal in paradoxes, Sergeant,
said Paimon, a smile in his terrible voice.
It is a question of love, you see.
He knelt and raised the knife blade before Abalene's face. The runes running along the honed edge shone, pristine and deadly. Abalene looked at it blearily.
This will mean the end of you, and centuries of health and strength for him,
said Paimon.
He will be an Astartes, a great champion like his ancestor. But you will not see it, and your trial will be great. Do you understand? Do you assent?
Abalene came back to herself, just enough to look the monster in its slow-burning eyes. He will live. He will be an Astartes, a hero of mankind.
He will live. He will be one of the Emperor's chosen sons. Mankind will tell stories of his great deeds.
Abalene nodded slowly. For the first time since the first alarm sirens had screamed across the skies above Ardenos, the graven lines of dread on her face smoothed, and her eyes cleared. The eyes had something like peace in them. I understand. I assent. Paimon made a quick motion with the knife, and a rune of Malice was traced on her forehead. The skin parted so deftly that there was a fleeting hesitation before the blood began to well. Abalene flinched once, then settled, squaring her shoulders for the promised ordeal. Paimon turned to the bed, swiftly slicing the same rune into her son's brow. The blood that appeared was thick and discolored. The boy moaned.
You ask how I understand, Sergeant,
said Paimon, raising his staff and whirling it above his helmed head with a murderous hum.
How I can say I understand love, despite being a creature of hatred, without even the ghost of a memory of my mother's face.
The shadows, the half-demon things from the distant realms of paradox and spite, orbited Paimon, twisting and twining furiously as if trying to force themselves into true existence.
Hate is not the opposite of love. Love's opposite is a bloodless loathing, a vulgar, inglorious thing. A man hates because he loves, or because he loved once. I understand love because I live and fight for such a great hatred. A hatred that bound me to a pitiless abomination of a deity in rebellion against the great gods who are the very principles of existence itself. Once you open yourself fully to that madness, you will come to understand.
He motioned with the knife again. More blood started from Abalene's arms. A law. She half cried out, then bit it back, eyes suddenly blazing.
Love.
The knife blade, now tainted with mingled blood, traced a sequence of runes in the air, written in sorcerous shadow. The runes swooped down into the boy's slack mouth, little barbs of darkness that plunged into his vitals, coldly scouring away disease and corruption, forming a crooked lattice that shielded the vital sinews of his laboring heart.
And hate.
The living shadows spiked through his brain and whispered harshly to the most primitive parts of him, the parts that slept beneath the silent black ocean at the bottom of the mind, telling them to activate and awaken.
Are the same.
The shadows hissed, venomous and satisfied, then fell into a reverent silence. Paimon looked at Abalene one last time. The woman was quaking, her eyes wide. The sorcerer raised a single finger to his visor in a shushing gesture. Abalene gnawed her lip and nodded back. The boy threw himself up from the bed in a frenzied jerk, like a coiled spring unleashing its brimming energy. He seemed almost suspended in the air for a straining moment before he crashed back onto the mattress, back arched, retching and twisting. Daniel screamed once, a broken animal keen. Then he fell silent. The boy sat up stiffly. Abalene looked into her son's eyes and quailed. There was nothing there. Just a hideous vacancy as total as the void between galaxies where nightmares bred. Love was gone. Pity was gone, but pain and fear were gone also, perhaps never to return. That gave her the smallest consolation, a single flickering flame in the impossible dark. She told herself it would have to be enough. She saw him tense, all predator, all jungle cat. She could not have known that the hunting beasts of Celis, the sons of Malice's long-stolen homeworld, would tense in the exact same way before they fell upon prey. But if she'd been told, she would have believed it. Abalene closed her eyes. The last thing she sensed before a nova of pain that swiftly passed into deep shock was the comforting scent of her husband's cigar smoke. Hunter fell upon prey. Teeth fastened and crooked fingers tore. Arterial spray slashed the air, dappled Kalfus's breastplate. He didn't notice. Paimon studied the patterns the blood made as it sprayed and spewed and soaked, and nodded curtly to himself. The omens were promising. When it was done, the boy looked up, his eyes bright and alert. The marks of disease on his cheeks and chest were hidden beneath thick smears of gore, but Paimon could tell that they were already paling. The teeming bacterium corralled by the ice of sorcery cycling in his veins so that the magically charged blood and flesh of the ritual could smother them to death.
"Congratulations, sorcerer,"
grunted Kalfus.
"I suppose your prophecies have rung true again, and you have found yourself an apprentice."
Paimon cocked his head.
"Almost,"
he said.
"But there is the small matter of extraction. I feel the great enemy's demented children drawing closer."
Kalfus's vox bead hissed.
"Plague Marines entering combat range,"
said Arius. The inappropriate smugness in his rough voice made his sergeant grimace.
"Mortarian sons?"
Kalfus asked.
"I don't think so. Some renegade rabble. Approach very sloppy. They have a modest 3-to-1 advantage, though. A counter-charge would be bracing, Sergeant." "We're not trying to retake the planet. Control yourself, battle brother. Control yourself."
The threat humming in Kalfus's voice was unsubtle. He heard Arius draw a harsh breath, presumably swallowing his hate. When his reply came, it was admirably free of open resentment.
"Understood, my sergeant."
There is a boil to be lanced here, Kalfus thought, but the operation will have to wait for another day on another world. He opened a channel to the rest of the squad.
"We only need to hold them long enough for the teleport homer to lock on. Defense pattern secundus. No unseemly displays of enthusiasm, or I'll remove some of your less useful organs. My brothers, fall silent."
The sons noiselessly took up firing positions with a practiced swiftness that did not require communication. As the plague Marines balled gracelessly into the mansion grounds, their squelching progress was brought to a staggering halt by a blistering fusillade. Rot-streaked power armor buckled and shattered, altered flesh pulped and spurted. Glottal curses filled the air between the crack of bolt shells. The advancing force's ponderous progress became glacial. Lingering body heat in the rampart of dead cultists baffled their armor's corroded sensors, and return fire tore into dead flesh or scarred the sculpted walls of the home Abalene had once been so proud of. Paimon led the boy by the hand, like the child he notionally was, though the eyes that glared starkly out of his bloodied face were no longer the eyes of boy or man. He led him out onto the roof, the other sons unhurriedly drawing back after them, halting at disciplined intervals to crack more volleys at the enemy. The boy looked down at Ardenos, at the streets where his faltering childhood feet had once walked, which now smoked with war and ran with corrosive filth. The buzzing of the infinite vortexes of flies was everywhere now. Even if the sons of Malice were not forbidden to speak in combat, it would have been impossible to hear anything other than the constant razored whine of the flies anyway. Cyclopean demons loomed over the neighborhood, their viridian eyes burning with triumph. Rooftops collapsed into spreading lakes of slurry, bobbing with hundreds of corpses. The boy's face contorted. There might have been a few fading motes of grief left, but as the last traces of his old identity were ground beneath the foundations of his new one, his expression spoke only of holy disgust. He looked away from Ardenos, to the cold, white-black shapes of his new brothers, admiring the sterile perfection of their hatred. No sickness or disease blighted them. In great armor were they clad. Finally, he looked up at the dying sky. Somewhere in the pristine vacuum, sensors roamed furiously like hunting hounds, prying at the toxified cloud cover to break through and lock onto the squad signal. A terrible ordeal to peer into a world in the process of falling down the plague god's gullet, but not impossible. The tide of putrescence lapped over the threshold of his home, swallowed everything he had ever loved. The last thought he had as a subject of the faraway God Emperor, before the black ice of the great god Malice's sorcerous will fully permeated his brain and his humanity fully froze over, was not of his dead father, or his mother's anguished face, or any sentimental yearning for girls' faces or childhood toys in the snow. It was his ancestor, tall and solemn and stern in armored plate, just as he stood on the canvas of a portrait currently melting out of its frame in one of the rooms below. In his mind's eye, the boy met the lost hero's gaze, and for a long moment the world became still. The universe became silent. The air around them became frigid. Beneath his visor, Paymon's white lips smiled. The boy closed his eyes as the cold light of the Teleportarian's esoteric energies turned the blood on his skin to ribbons of black against white. When he opened them, he stood on the black iron deck of the Thesis of Hate, hunter ship of the traitorous fraternity of the Sons of Malice. Doomed once men, at war with the universe.